The morning air was bitter and sharp as Eli shifted under the stiff wool blanket he'd found near the back of an abandoned laundromat. The rusted metal of the bench beneath him pressed into his bones, and he winced as a dull ache surged through his side. He touched the spot gently and closed his eyes, not because he was tired, but because he didn't want to see the day begin again. For years now, the city had passed by him in waves of hurried footsteps and indifferent glances. He used to count the people who looked him in the eye, but somewhere along the line he'd stopped. Eli hadn't always been on the streets. There was a time when his name was spoken with pride, when he'd laugh at jokes over dinner and fall asleep in a warm bed. He used to teach history at a community college, and he loved telling stories that made the past feel alive. But life, as it sometimes does, unraveled in silence. A layoff turned into missed rent turned into eviction, and the world just kept turning without him. His sister had died of cancer the year before the job loss, and without her steady presence, Eli had felt like a kite with a broken string. The final blow came when he collapsed in a parking lot behind a convenience store, coughing up blood and gasping for air. The hospital discharged him with a diagnosis and a prescription he couldn't afford. His condition was treatable, but required surgery. Without it, the pain would grow and complications could be fatal. He remembered the way the nurse avoided eye contact as she handed him his papers, as if kindness might crack the walls of policy. Now each morning began the same. He'd scan the street for bottles to return, sometimes dig through the trash bins behind the deli on Main for food. He'd learned which dumpsters were cleanest and which shops were most likely to throw out half-eaten sandwiches. He wore 3 layers of clothing in winter, all donated, all too big, and each carrying a memory of a stranger he'd never meet. There were nights he thought about simply not waking up, letting the ache in his body take him quietly while the world slept. But something in him resisted. Maybe a memory of his sister's laugh, maybe a line from one of the poems he used to teach. He never begged, not because of pride, but because he didn't know how. People passed with headphones in, coffee cups in hand, talking to people who were not him. The world had shrunk to the size of a city block, and yet his mind wandered far. He still noticed the little things, a dog that waited for the walk signal, the sound of a saxophone player under the subway stairs, the way light fell across cracked pavement in the late afternoon. These were the details that kept him tethered to a sense of meaning. On a particularly cold morning, Eli coughed hard, harder than usual, and blood spattered his jacket. He sat down slowly, breathless, and wondered if that would be the day he'd fall and not get back up. People walked past him. A child pointed at him, but the mother pulled the child close and crossed to the other side. Eli wasn't angry. He understood fear. He understood the way the world teaches people to look away. That afternoon, he managed to pull together enough change to buy a cup of soup from the vendor near the courthouse. He sat with the warm cup nestled in his hands, steam rising like hope he didn't trust. He thought about the surgery again, about how a simple operation could give him years back. Not just life, but dignity. But that world was a mile away, and every step toward it was blocked by red tape and locked doors. He knew the names of the nurses at the free clinic, but they knew him only as the man in the brown coat. The ache in his side grew deeper and darker. He tried to keep his mind sharp, still reading discarded newspapers, still mumbling history facts under his breath, as if his old students might appear and ask him a question. He missed teaching more than he missed food. When you've lost your place in the world, knowledge becomes the last proof you ever belonged. His only possession of real value was a weathered copy of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, tucked inside a plastic bag to keep it dry. Sometimes he'd read aloud from it, and even if no one listened, it made him feel human again. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of gold and violet, Eli sat on the edge of the park fountain, whispering a line about hope and stars. A pigeon landed nearby, unafraid. The moment was still, delicate. And then the pain returned, sharper this time. He leaned forward and clutched his side, wheezing. The city around him moved on. Cars honked, sirens wailed, laughter spilled out of bars and restaurants. And Eli remained where he was, on the edge of everything, unseen and unheard. In the distance, a woman walked by, camera slung over her shoulder, pausing briefly before disappearing down the avenue. Eli didn't notice her, not yet, but life, even in its darkest corners, sometimes holds on to grace in the smallest of details. The bench, the cup of soup, the fading light, all quietly setting the stage for something he could never have imagined. Lena walked with her camera tucked under her coat, the late autumn wind biting at her fingers as she adjusted the lens and looked for something real to capture. She had spent the day weaving through city streets for her ongoing photo series on Forgotten Lives, a personal project she'd started after losing her father the previous year. He used to say that stories lived in the corners of the world, not the spotlight. It was his voice she followed when she noticed the man slumped near the park fountain, shoulders hunched, eyes distant, a tattered book clutched in his hand like it meant everything. She raised the camera and paused. Something about his presence stopped her. He wasn't performing pain. He wasn't asking for pity. He simply existed there like part of the city itself, worn down but quietly holding on. She lowered the camera and approached gently, her boots crunching on the gravel. She knelt a few feet away and offered him a nod, nothing more. He glanced at her briefly, then looked back at the ground. His voice, when it came, was soft and cracked like paper that had been folded too many times. He said her camera looked expensive, and she smiled, telling him it wasn't as fancy as it looked. She asked his name. He hesitated, then said Eli. She introduced herself and asked if she could sit. He shrugged. They talked not about suffering or charity or need, but about books, Walt Whitman, the rhythms of language, the weight of memory. She listened, really listened, and realized she was speaking to someone whose mind still burned with intelligence and insight. Eli mentioned teaching once, long ago, and she could see in the way he recited dates and names that he had loved it. As the sun dipped lower, his coughing worsened and Lena's smile faltered. She watched him wince and press his hand to his side, his body folding inward as if trying to disappear. She asked what was wrong and he waved it off, embarrassed, but she pressed gently until he finally told her. A condition, treatable, a surgery he couldn't afford. His words were spare, each one shaped by years of silence and dismissal. Lena felt something twist in her chest. She knew that look. Her father had worn it in his final months, the quiet surrender of someone who had stopped believing help would come. As Eli spoke, she made a silent decision. She couldn't walk away. That night she went home and couldn't sleep. She sat by her laptop rereading the few notes she'd scribbled after their talk. The image of him sitting with that book in his lap, body failing but mind intact, stayed with her. She thought about the money in her account. Not much, but enough. To start something. She created a page on a crowdfunding site, uploaded a portrait of Eli she'd taken just before leaving, and wrote about his story. She didn't make it dramatic. She made it honest. A man who once gave his life to teaching, now silenced by a system that had no room for him. She shared the link with friends, her small photography community, her old college group. The next day a few donations trickled in, then a few more. One woman who had been in Eli's class years ago wrote, "I remember him. He believed in me when no one else did." The fundraiser picked up speed. Within 4 days it crossed $1,000. Lena visited Eli again. This time she brought soup, clean socks, and a printed copy of the campaign page. He stared at it for a long time, then looked up at her and asked why. "Why him?" She answered simply. "Because you matter." He shook his head, but his eyes watered and he turned away. Lena told him they were halfway to what the clinic needed to consider scheduling the surgery. He didn't speak for a long while. Then, he asked if she'd be there when it happened. She promised she would. From that moment on, Lena became more than a visitor. She became his advocate. She called clinics. She filled out paperwork. She used her connections at the community kitchen to get him meals and access to a temporary shower unit. Each small. Victory was a crack in the wall that had surrounded him for so long. Eli started smiling more. He began to stand taller. He even gave Lena a small history lesson one day about the founding of the city, and when she asked if he missed teaching, he nodded with tears in his eyes. On the 10th day after they met, the fundraiser hit its goal. Lena wept when she saw the final number. Eli, stunned, just kept shaking his head. They had done it. A surgery date was set for the following week. The day before the operation, Lena brought Eli a new jacket. He held it like it was made of gold. As they waited at the clinic for final tests, he reached out and touched her hand. His grip was weak but steady. He said thank you in a voice so full of emotion, it broke something open inside her. In that moment, she realized this was not about charity. It was about connection. It was about seeing someone and saying, "You are not invisible." That night as she walked home, Lena stopped at the fountain where they had first met. The bench was empty, but something lingered there. Not sadness, not loss, but the echo of something just beginning. The day of the surgery arrived beneath a sky heavy with grey clouds, as if the world itself held its breath for Eli. And while the city moved on in its usual blur of sirens and footsteps, there was a quiet intensity inside the small community clinic, where Lena sat beside him, gripping his hand as they waited for his name to be called. Eli wore the new jacket she had given him, but he seemed far away, his fingers trembling slightly against the folds of the hospital intake papers. He hadn't slept much the night before, and neither had Lena. She'd brought a book of poetry in her bag, and every so often she read aloud softly, more for her own nerves than his. Eli smiled faintly each time she paused to take a breath. When the nurse came to take him in, Eli turned to Lena and asked if she would still be there when he woke up. She nodded without hesitation and watched as they wheeled him through the narrow doors into the operating room. Alone in the waiting area, Lena sat with her hands clasped tightly, staring at the wall clock, which ticked louder than usual. Time stretched unbearably. She thought about everything that had led to this moment, the winding path that had brought a stranger into her life and changed them both. When the doctor finally emerged, his mask down, and a calm look on his face, Lena stood before he even spoke, and his first words were, "It went well." Relief crashed over her in a wave, and she closed her eyes, letting the tension melt from her shoulders. Eli was alive, the surgery was a success, and now the healing could begin. The next few days were quiet but filled with small victories. Eli's color improved, his voice grew stronger, and the deep pain that once dominated his every movement began to ease. He joked for the first time in weeks, asking Lena if his hospital gown made him look intellectual. She laughed with tears in her eyes and told him he looked like someone who just might take over the world. The clinic gave him a room for recovery, and Lena visited every day, bringing soup books, socks, and sometimes just her presence. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, history books, music, and the strange way life brings people together. One afternoon, as she adjusted his blanket, Eli reached out and placed a hand over hers, and in that simple gesture she felt the full weight of everything they had been through. He told her he hadn't felt human in a long time until she came along. It was a statement so raw, so honest, that neither of them spoke for a long moment. After 2 weeks, Eli was able to walk again without clutching his side, and the doctors were amazed by his resilience. The man who had once struggled to stand now walked down the hallway slowly but upright, and with each step he took, Lena could see something returning to him, a sense of worth, a spark of hope. The clinic's social worker began helping him with ID paperwork and enrollment in a housing program made possible by his new medical records and status. It wasn't just the surgery that changed him. It was the chain of belief that Lena had started, the idea that he was more than his circumstances, more than the cold pavement or the charity line. One day during a particularly sunny afternoon, Eli stood at the window of his recovery room, watching children chase each other in the courtyard below. Lena walked in, and he turned to her smiling, saying, "I never thought I'd live to see a day like this again." She walked over and stood beside him, not saying anything, just letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. Healing wasn't instant, but it was steady, and every new morning brought another piece of himself back to Eli. The final night before his discharge, they sat side by side on the little bench in the clinic garden. Eli told her about his sister, how she used to sing old Motown songs when they were young, and how he'd once dreamed of writing a book about lost voices in history. Lena listened without interrupting because she knew some stories needed space to breathe. When he finished, he looked at her and said, "I don't think I would have survived if you hadn't come along," and Lena responded softly, "I think we both needed each other." There was no grand applause, no headlines, just two people sitting under a Fading sky filled with the quiet wonder of having made it through. The world hadn't changed, but theirs had, and as they looked toward tomorrow, there was something beautiful in the knowledge that it all began with a single conversation by a broken fountain in the heart of a restless city. Eli stepped out of the clinic doors with a small duffel bag in one hand, and the weight of a second chance resting quietly on his shoulders. The air felt different, like he was breathing not just for survival, but for living, and Lena walked beside him, not as a caretaker now, but as a friend, someone who had stood by him when the world didn't know he existed. A local housing support group helped him into a transitional apartment, and when he opened the door to the small space, just one bed, a desk, and a little kitchenette, he stood there, frozen, unable to move because it had been years since he had a door to close behind him, a place where the wind didn't bite through the cracks and where sleep didn't come with fear. He turned to Lena and simply said, "It's mine," with disbelief in his voice, and she smiled so wide her eyes welled up with tears. The first few nights were difficult. His body was still healing, but it was the silence that unsettled him most after so long, surrounded by noise and cold and the rawness of the street. The quiet of safety felt almost unfamiliar. Lena visited often, bringing fresh groceries and clean sheets and little things like tea and candles, because she said every home deserved warmth. Eli started reading again, not just to pass the time, but to feed his mind something that had long gone hungry. And when Lena brought him a used laptop, he nearly cried, holding it like it was sacred, because for him, it was a doorway back into the world he used to know. He began writing slowly, at first scribbles, then paragraphs, and soon he was drafting essays about his experiences, connecting the dots between his fall and the wider systems that failed people like him every day. Lena encouraged him to share his voice, and through one of her gallery contacts, she arranged for a small reading event at a neighborhood art cafe, where Eli stood with his hands trembling, holding a worn notebook, and read his piece titled, "The Day Someone Saw Me," to a room that fell completely silent with every word. When he finished, the room erupted in quiet applause, and he looked down, surprised, as if he hadn't expected the world to listen. But they did. From that day forward, Eli became more than a man who had been helped. He became a storyteller, a witness, and a mirror for those who had never seen the faces behind the statistics. His writing was picked up by a non-profit publication, and he began speaking at shelters and schools, sharing not just his journey, but the truth about what happens when society stops looking. And everywhere he went, he mentioned Lena not as a savior, but as a reminder that kindness doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be real. People began reaching out to her too, strangers who had followed the fundraiser or heard about her photographs, asking how they could help. Inspired by what she had experienced, Lena launched a new photo project titled The Reclaimed, capturing portraits and stories of people like Eli who had faced impossible odds but found light through connection. Eli's portrait was the first in the series, taken not on a park bench, but in front of a wall of books in his new home. And in the photo he smiled, not the small guarded smile from the day they met, but a full, genuine one, the kind that speaks of healing. The project gained traction and was exhibited in 3 local galleries, with proceeds going to transitional housing programs and medical outreach for the homeless. Lena and Eli attended the opening night together and stood side by side as visitors walked through the gallery, some with tears in their eyes, others quietly taking it all in. And when a young boy pointed at Eli's photo and asked his mother if that man was a hero, Eli looked away shyly, but Lena said yes softly, because in her eyes he was. The impact of Lena's one act of compassion rippled outward through Eli to a community that had long been ignored, and with each person touched by the story, another small light turned on. Eli wasn't just healing himself anymore, he was becoming a bridge for others, a voice that echoed for those who hadn't yet been heard. And Lena, she found her purpose not just in capturing moments, but in creating them, in building connections through stories and reminding people that sometimes the smallest act, a conversation, a shared meal, a hand held during a hard moment, can spark a transformation beyond measure. They often sat together in the cafe where he first read his work, talking about life and memory and dreams. And sometimes they didn't speak at all, just shared the quiet, knowing that their lives were forever woven together by something larger than either of them. What began as a single gesture on a cold afternoon had become a movement of quiet revolution, proving that kindness may not fix the world all at once, but it can change someone's entire world in a moment. Months passed and the city moved on with its usual rhythm of urgency, but for Eli and Lena, time had begun to stretch in a more meaningful way each day, adding a new layer to a story neither of them could have written alone. And as winter gave way to spring, Eli found himself waking with purpose, not just because he had things to do, but because he believed he still had something to give, and that belief had grown roots inside him, watered by the kindness that had once seemed so far out of reach. He began volunteering part-time at the same shelter he had once relied on, walking through its doors now not as someone seeking warmth, but as someone offering it, and he quickly became known among the regulars as a quiet, steady presence, someone who didn't speak down or offer pity, but listened with the kind of attention that makes you feel seen. And more than once he sat across from someone in pain and said, "I've been where you are," and those words carried more weight than 1,000 policies. At night he wrote more often and with deeper clarity, and his second piece, a story about the invisible threads of survival, was published by a national non-profit, leading to interviews and podcast invitations, and every time he was asked how things had changed, he said, "I was given a chance and I took it, but it never would have started if someone hadn't stopped to see me." Lena watched from the sidelines, never seeking credit, only pride as Eli stepped further into himself, and she continued capturing the lives of those who had once been silenced, using her camera not as a barrier, but as a bridge, and the Gallery Project expanded, drawing attention from advocacy groups and city organizers who began funding outreach programs based on the awareness it created. One afternoon as they walked through the neighborhood together, Eli paused outside a vacant storefront and turned to her saying, "Wouldn't it be something if we had a place where stories like mine could be shared, where people could walk in, not for help but for hope?" And Lena lit up at the idea because it wasn't just a dream, it was a plan waiting to take form. They called it the Hearth, a small but welcoming space tucked between a bookstore and a coffee shop, and it opened with a simple mission to amplify unheard voices and build real connections. The walls were covered in portraits from Lena's series, and a corner shelf held printed copies of Eli's essays, and anyone could walk in, sit down, share their story, or listen to someone else's. And slowly, people began coming in, not in crowds, but in steady steps, the way flowers find light after a long season of dark. A retired nurse who had once been homeless started a health workshop there. A high schooler volunteered to teach tech skills. An elderly man who had lost his wife found community through poetry readings. The Hearth wasn't just a place. It became a symbol of what could happen when compassion was allowed to grow into action. And for Eli, it was a kind of homecoming, not just to a roof and walls, but to himself. One evening, a woman came in holding the hand of a small boy. She looked unsure of what to expect and asked if someone named Eli was there because she had read his piece online and thought maybe he could talk to her son who had stopped speaking. After they'd lost their home, and Eli knelt beside the boy and said, "You don't have to talk yet, I just want you to know I see you." And the boy looked at him and nodded, and in that moment, 1,000 unspoken things passed between them and Lena. Captured the moment quietly from a distance, tears in her eyes. That photo later became the centerpiece of their second exhibition, titled Return to Light, and it drew people from all walks of life, reminding them that healing wasn't a straight line, but a shared journey. The city council took notice, and funding increased for the programs the Hearth supported, and slowly other neighborhoods began asking how they could replicate what Eli and Lena had built. Still, they never chased recognition. They chased stories, they chased healing. And sometimes on quiet evenings when the day's work was done, they would sit by the back window of the Hearth, watching the city lights blink on one by one, and Eli would say softly, "I used to think I was forgotten, but now I know I was just waiting to be found," and Lena would squeeze his hand and say, "I'm glad we found each other." Because in the end, the greatest transformations are not those made with noise or applause, but those born from presence and choice, and a moment of courage that says, "I will not walk away when someone needs me." And it was that choice that echoed. Through every life they touched a simple truth: written not in headlines but in hearts. Years later, on a crisp autumn morning, with the golden leaves dancing across the sidewalk, Eli stood outside the hearth as the sun crept over the rooftops, casting a soft light on the familiar mural by the door, a painting that Lena had created with the words "Everyone deserves to be seen" etched across it in quiet reverence, and he held a warm mug of tea in his hands, breathing in the scent with the kind of peace that only comes from surviving what tried to break you and finding something beautiful. On the other side, inside the space was already buzzing with gentle movement. Volunteers setting up chairs, a young girl nervously practicing her poem in the corner, a teacher preparing a writing workshop, and Lena placing fresh flowers on the windowsill like she did every Saturday, because she said it reminded her that something new could bloom anywhere, even in the most forgotten corners of the city. It was the 3rd anniversary of the Hearth, and they were hosting a community celebration, but for Eli, it felt like something more than just a date. It felt like a quiet miracle proof that pain could lead to purpose, that one moment of kindness could ripple outward further than anyone imagined. As the event began, people started to gather, not just old friends, but new faces, many of whom had been touched by the work that began with Lena's simple decision to stop that day so long ago when a man sat hurting by a fountain and she chose to care instead of walk away, and that story had found its way into local schools, city halls and homes. It had changed policy, yes, but more importantly, it had changed hearts. Eli watched from a quiet spot near the back as a woman stood on stage reading an excerpt from his latest essay, her voice catching as she said the words, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." And the room fell silent, not with sorrow but with recognition, because every person there knew the truth behind those words and had lived their own version of it. After the reading, someone brought out a small cake with the words, "Here's to the light," carved into the frosting, and people laughed and clapped and sang, not loudly but sincerely, the way you do when you know you're part of something rare, something honest. Lena sat beside Eli, then nudging him gently, and he looked at her not with words but with the kind of look that says thank you without needing to be spoken, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, just for a moment, letting the weight of the years settle softly between them. As the crowd slowly thinned and the sky shifted into shades of evening, a boy approached Eli holding a folded piece of paper, saying quietly, "I wrote something because of you." And Eli took it with both hands, unfolding it like a gift and reading it. Right there, the words written in shaky print but filled with courage, and when he finished, he looked up and said, "This is important. Thank you for sharing it." And the boy smiled wider than he had in weeks and ran back to his mom, who wiped her eyes and mouthed "thank you" from across the room. It was in these moments that the true impact of their journey was felt, not in numbers or headlines, but in small connections, in dignity restored, and in hope planted where it had once been barren. And while Lena had long since returned to her photography, full-time her work had never again been about just the image. It was about the soul behind it, and she often said that meeting Eli had taught her how to see in ways no lens ever could. That night, before they closed the hearth for the evening, they stood together at the front door looking out into the quiet street, and Eli said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day?" And Lena replied, "I don't, because I did, and we're here now. And that's enough." Then they locked up, turned off the lights and walked side by side into the night air, not with the weight of the past, but with the warmth of everything they had built together, because theirs was not a story about saving or being saved. It was a story about choosing to care and choosing again and again to show up, even when it was hard. And in that choice they had created a space not just for healing, but for becoming a living reminder that kindness has power, and when given freely, it can turn a single life into a source of light for many. And in the stillness of that night, beneath the stars that stretched over a city too big to ever fully know, Eli smiled and whispered the words he had once written in secret, but now shared with pride. There is no such thing as a small act of love, because even the smallest ones carry the weight of something eternal. And in that truth, they walked on into whatever came next.